your express ticket to the New Zealand House of Representatives. Every episode, we unravel the complex world of legislation, debate, and democracy. From bills to select committees, we've got it all covered. So fasten your seatbelts because you're about to dive deep into the heart of New Zealand's political landscape. Stay tuned, stay informed, and stay engaged with the Order Paper podcast.
And kia ora, it's 12:07. We've had a very interesting start today. We've been trying to get one of our panelists, Rex, to come in, and for some reason, it keeps giving him a black. It keeps making us appear as a black screen to him, and it makes him appear as a black screen to us. So it's been a bit of a rigmarole on how we've started. So that's the reason why we're starting at 12:08 instead of the normal usual time. So it's definitely a bit of a start for the morning. Now, so Gabrielle, can we please bring you in? Is your camera ready to fire away? Please tell me we haven't got echo silence on silence here as well, Gabrielle. Okay, well, we'll wait for him to come in while we sit there and start getting things moving. So today's show is we're going to focus on. So there's there's a multitude of bills that are in there, but our biggest ones we want to focus on is the Residential Tenancy Act changes that are coming through there, which was read on the House on Tuesday and followed by Thursday. We've got Rex in there. At least that's something.
Turn it that way. There we go.
Yes.
Try and make some adjustment. Okay, this looks terrible, but at least I'm here.
It works. It works. Yeah. Gabrielle's just he's now having the fun technical parts that go wrong. And actually, it's good you've come in now, because if we played a video through the software, it flips your screen up.
Oh, okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we've learned that one with Blake of how to sit there and do that. So Rex, give us a bit about yourself, so the audience sits here and what electorate you live in.
Well, I live in Hutt South, which has, of course, been interesting of late. For many, many years, we had Fraser Coleman, who owned it and was a very good local MP, I have to say. Rose to be a cabinet minister in the Kirk government, and was the man who went on the boats to Mururoa Atoll to represent us there. So he wasn't a bad MP. And then, of course, he retired, and we had a whole lot of Labor. What shall I say? Grandees parachuted in to give them a safe seat to eke out their retirement and earn a nice parliamentary pension. So we were taken for granted for a wee while, and then things got interesting. Of course, when we got Chris Bishop, who was probably the first credible national candidate that I can remember ever being offered to us, and it seems the electorate grasped him with both hands and elected him. So we had the seat flip. And then Ginny Anderson won it back again. And then, of course, at the last election, it flipped again. So we now have Chris Bishop as our elected MP and Ginny is our list MP. As for me, I've spent most of the last 30 years as a journalist, editor of various titles, including a few national publications. I was a talkback host on Radio Pacific for a while, did breakfast there. And at the moment, also a journalist writing for various publications and a correspondent for a couple of TV channels in the UK. And I run Hutt Radio, which is based, as the name suggests, in Lower Hutt.
And you've got to sit there and drive through a Labour electorate to my green oasis here in Rongotai.
Yes, not too far.
I know, which actually you've probably actually have seen that, how considering Rongotai was under MMP, it's been red all the way through, and I think Bill Young's been the only one who actually was able to make it blue for a period, probably in the same way that Chris Bishop has done that to Hutt South.
Yeah, that's all right. I'd forgotten Bill. Apologies to Bill if you happen to be around. I had forgotten Bill was your MP out there for a while. Yeah, that's right. It was very much a red electorate. You had Annette King for a long time, didn't you?
Yes, even though I've got to say I've only been in here since 2014, which and I've got to admit half of that period was actually living in a Hario electorate. But yes, I do remember when Annette King was the local MP, and actually she was the person who got the local fruit and vegetable market, Newtown Market, going. Basically was the MP who liaised to get the school going, which actually is a vital part to my business income to this day. So I can thank Annette King with the help of Stephen Young for setting up the Newtown Fruit and Vegetable Market, and Stephen's son Damien still runs it to this day.
Well, that's it's people look at MPs and assess them on their work in Parliament, and then wonder how on earth they got elected. Sometimes, which I always did with Peter Dunn, but I was told that his secret was indeed that he did a lot locally, and people, I was told that he was feted locally for getting a crossing put in front of the local school. And look, that's fine. I mean, more of a council job, really. And if you want to do that, then maybe stand as a councillor. But anyway, he managed to get a long and very slippery political career out of crossings and turning up to the opening of an envelope. So yeah, that's how some MPs survive, I guess. But Annette, I'm not certainly putting into that category. She was a very good MP and a very good minister in her time.
And she was prepared to have photos taken with her wearing gumboots.
Yes, true.
And Gabrielle, we've now got you in here. So, what electorate you're coming from? No audio. Okay, yeah. Or something we can say, funnily enough, here is because I know which electorate Gabrielle is coming from, which is Invercargill. But I can sit there and say there, if we wanted to go for multi-electorates, I think we're all in Te Tai Tonga at the moment.
Hello. Can you hear me now?
Yes, you can. Yeah, because which part of Laha are you coming from, Rex? Are you coming from this side of the Wainui Hill or the other side?
I'm in Wainui at the moment.
So yeah, I'm Te Tai Tonga. Oh, so we can't sit there and say we're all in the Te Tai Tonga electorate.
Yep.
Okay, so we've got Gabrielle's on there. So how are you there today? Finally coming in.
Really good. Down here in sunny Southland. My electorate here is the deep south, old Invercargill. And yeah, no, I think it's a beautiful electorate. Seems to, I think, yeah, we've had a really interesting history. We've had a colorful set of MPs, I think, for a little while. And yeah, there's some pretty major changes, come through after the last election. And yeah, I mean, it's a good place to be. And it seems like, I think for the most part, I think now we tend to be, picking pretty good people for the job in terms of our electorate MPs. But yeah, no, it's a funny little place in Invercargill.
Yes, and I do remember your local MP was the one that inspired me to buy a tree-shaped waffle maker.
Well, there you go. Can't go wrong with that.
Yeah, which we had a bit of a laugh about, and I'm now selling gluten-free, dairy-free, vegan-free, vegan waffles at the Newtown Market.
Right.
As we were mentioning earlier with the coffee cart.
Most of my waffles are vegan-free, but
Oh, trying to find gluten-free waffle mix is not exactly easy, and I've had to buy that from a website called Te Ao Pablo, or I think translated Te Ao into English, I think would be Uncle Pablo. You can tell me that because you're a native Spanish speaker. Or according to Google Translate, that is. Yeah. Okay, so we'll sit there and get onto the Residential Tenancy Act. So do we want to hear Chris Bishop's legislative statement, or should we get straight to Kira McAnulty's rebuttal?
Let's see what old Chrissy has to say first, eh?
It's quite some time. So this is his. The first speech to the Residential Tenancy Amendment Bill Act.
Not getting any audio on my end, by the way.
Neither am I.
Hold on. Okay, just a moment. Stop. Okay, go through there. Video on demand. Also share the audio into the tab. which we've got to do. So let's try that again.
Select Committee to consider the bill. Mr. Speaker, this
Audio
is
coming
an important bill that proposes sensible, much-needed changes to the Residential Tenancies Act 1986, which will remove barriers to increasing private rental housing supply, as well as introducing pet bond provisions, which is part of the National Act coalition agreement and has generated a lot of excitement amongst many people, particularly pet owners. Mr. Speaker, the approach of the previous government when it came to landlords ultimately caused worse outcomes for tenants. Rents increased rapidly under the last government. The social housing waitlist that we've been talking about a bit in the House over the last couple of days increased by around 20,000 families. And of course we have, very sadly, many families in New Zealand living in emergency housing motels. Not all of these problems can be put down to the residential tenancies changes that the previous government implemented in progressive stages, but some of those problems can be put down to that. For example, Mr. Speaker, the removal of 90-day no-cause terminations by the last government made some landlords unwilling to take a chance on tenants who don't have perfect references or a steady 9-to-5 job or just left prison, for example,
Do a paper on it
for a
2 a.m. in
variety
the
of
morning.
reasons. Landlords didn't want to take a chance on, and many landlords just decided to exit the market altogether. I've had many people say to me, the combination of interest deductibility, 90-day no-cause terminations, the bright line test, it's all just too hard, I'm out. And ultimately, mum and dad landlords, Mr. Speaker, are an important part of the housing market in New Zealand. So this bill reintroduces 90-day no-cause terminations for periodic tenancies. It also fixes the situation around the end of fixed-term tenancies, and the last government's changes to essentially make the rollover of fixed-term tenancies into periodic tenancies essentially automatic has caused chaos in a variety of markets, most notably down in Queenstown, where previously there was a situation where many people would offer up properties into the market for, say, 6 to 9 months when they didn't need to use the property, so become available for a fixed-term tenancy. The near-automatic rollover of those fixed-term tenancies into periodic tenancies has meant that people just think it's all too difficult. We'll just put the property on Airbnb, and then the property just is not used for much of the time. So we have the situation in Queenstown where you've got a real homelessness problem. You've got workers unable to get access to accommodation. I see my good friend and colleague Joseph Mooney here, the MP for Queenstown and the wider region. And so we are going to fix that problem. And the Chamber of Commerce down there has made this point multiple times in the media. Because interestingly, the former Minister of Housing, Megan Woods, turned up there at the height of all of this. I think it was it July last year, maybe August, where it was around then. We were approaching the HQ. She said, I acknowledge. She said,
I think we're heading to some waffle now from the bush. But I think we get the general gist of the bill. Rex, have you ever been a landlord? Because you're probably of a generation where you're more likely to have been in that boat.
Oh, dear me. These assumptions. No, I never have. And quite honestly, I'm pleased I'm not, because I think I'd be too soft-hearted to be a landlord. I really would. I could never evict anybody unless they were absolutely, damaging the property or something. I'd probably end up living in a tent if I needed my home back and there was a family living in it instead. So no, I calculated once that I've moved 40 times in my life, so I've certainly been a tenant quite a lot, but luckily I own the house I'm living in now, but no, I've never been a landlord.
Okay. No, I mean, I've got to admit, I've never owned a house, but I have grew up in home ownership of parents owning the properties, and the first time I probably went into the renting scene was when moving our dad's place and moving into Cambridge Street back in Levin years ago. So that's my one. But I was living with the house owner, so my real experience of dealing with landlords wasn't until moving to Wellington. Yeah. What about yourself, Gabrielle? I mean, because you've done multiple countries.
Yeah, no, sure have. No, I am also very pleased to report that yours truly is, in fact, not a class trader. And that's not to say that it's impossible for me to share a panel with someone who has been a landlord. But I do think that there is, housing justice is definitely, my bread and butter. That's why, hopped onto the panel this morning. You flicked me a message today, Sam, saying we're talking about housing, and I'm like, oh, bloody can't miss this one.
I know. I knew you'll be in it. I mean, put it this way: we're like talking about multi-wards.
Yeah, interesting. I'll see if I've got time to make for that conversation as well, because I think that one's very interesting too. But yeah, no, definitely, not a landlord. Have lived a few places overseas, but I do have to qualify that in saying that my experience with the private rental market has thus far been limited to New Zealand, because I my family and I, we came here about sort of 10 years ago, over 10 years ago now. It's not a good situation. I think New Zealand's legislative attitude and view around housing is really only working for a small landowning minority within the country that is shrinking by the day because of the way that New Zealand has chosen to approach housing. I think Chris's comments are it's interesting how he can acknowledge certain material realities and then come to some rather, I'll be honest, quite unhinged conclusions. But before I start my little diatribe, I wanted to know if you guys wanted to weigh in first, because I've got a fair bit to say about what Chris has already said.
Well, the interesting part is, it doesn't feel like Chris Bishop's trying to play towards the Labour voter stuck with the national banner on him.
Yeah, I think the other interesting thing is this government, for all its heralding of Chris Luxon's business experience and how the government was going to take a very factually oriented approach to the way it was going to run the country. They've done absolutely nothing of the sort. I don't want to divert the discussion. I think the biggest example of that is the way that they've handled the public service cuts. Instead of saying, what do we want to get out of it? What are our objectives? I mean, I've run a lot of businesses. So you start with your objectives. What do we want? Okay, now do we have the structure in place to get those deliverables? Okay, if we've got too many people, we might start looking at cutting people, but we would look at, what is it in the production line? Probably not. It's in management. So there'd be a little bit of a direction, not just slash everybody by 6%. Thank you. So, and coming back to what Chris said, it's all anecdotal. I've had people saying to me, "Oh, my mate behind me," what he was going to ramble on about, I don't know. But he should be, and I'm sure he's probably got somewhere, some figures. What happened to the rental market when these changes were made? Were there actual properties? Quantify that. Don't give me anecdote and base legislation on that and expect me to swallow that it's necessary. So that's my opinion on what he said.
Yeah, and I also, one of the things I've noticed is we seem to have this one-way accountability thing there. Like, we're writing our laws based on the worst tenants, but to me, reintroduction of 90-day no-cause evictions is an example of, I can't be bothered to keeping paperwork properly, and so I want an exemption for it. Whereas in employment sector, you cannot sit there and do that. You cannot do that as being a professional like a doctor or lawyers, that sort of thing. There, you'll not be able to sit there and say that. A council would not be able to go, oh no, was it 90 days? We don't have to sit there and show any paperwork or do anything. It's over and done with. It seems to be like a get out of jail free card for being sloppy on record keeping. That's what I see 90-day no-clause evictions. I'm not sure if that's universal, my opinion on that one. That's just my, that's what it does feel like. And I mean, I've had a 90-day no-clause eviction, which felt very unjustified, hurtful, and very blindsided. And I've also had one where I've had recently where it was like, it was, yes, I've got to give you 90 days to move out, but it was a very structured reason why what went wrong. And it made complete sense, which was the fact that he had to rip out half the bathroom to sit there and do it, and he didn't know what the problem was until he got the wall off. And it could be you could be without a bathroom for a few weeks, or the house could be without a bathroom for 6 months, sort of scenario. So he was caught between it. And see, that reasoning shows it doesn't sour the relationship if there's some logic behind it. But a 90-day you're out feels a bit. If you're on the receiving end of it, you're feeling like you can't, like, it just feels like a cop out of like no reasoning behind it. And an honest, good landlord wouldn't do that. They would actually say why.
You're assuming there's such a thing to begin with there, my friend.
Oh, there are good landlords. I've got to be honest. What do you call it? Abdullah, my former landlord, I would sit there and do it. If you spoke to my former flatmate Charles, he would sit there and say something completely different. But my dealings with him, both him and my live-in landlord Colin Russell were probably the best landlords I've ever had dealt with.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I'll be honest. I think, like, in all sincerity, there's, I mean, I'm sure there's good ticket scalping services out there, this sort of thing as well. So absolutely, like, I think the reality of what a landlord is and does, you can definitely do it with a smile and with a nice firm handshake. But at the end of the day, I think it's, because for me personally, I tend to find myself to be quite partial to, like, solid free market ideas and economic policy. And it's on that basis that I actually agree with Adam Smith's conclusions about the landlord and about the fact that it is a pure economic net loss. There's nothing being provided for by means of either ticket scalping or house scalping, especially in a residential context. What I think is really fascinating, though, about what Chris has said, and I'm totally with you, Rex, a lot of what he's pointing out is, anecdotal. But, not only withstanding that, but like the worst case scenario that Chris is consistently bringing up here is, people choosing to exit, the residential landlord market, the residential retail rental market. And what I think is really funny about that is, where are the tears to be shed about that? Because, like, the reality is, when people have a property and they're choosing to rent seek that property, ultimately what they're choosing to do whenever they leave that market is that property is more than likely going to go to an owner occupier, or it goes to another landlord. Like, those are really fundamentally your.
That's assuming it's getting sold and not just sitting there empty and becoming derelict.
Yeah, for sure. I might have to duck away here. It looks like there could be a family emergency going on, but you guys have a good chat there.
Okay.
Good.
I know, families. Should we, you want something to add before we get to Karen's rebuttal?
Let's see what Karen has to say, because I mean, that basically they've undone everything that Labor did, which again concerns me a little bit. It seems to be more of a what's the word I'm looking for? An appeasement.
Efforts.
Yeah, I think without really considering, okay, this is what happens in politics so much in this country, is we swing the pendulum from extreme to extreme. So we possibly went a little bit too far under Labor. Now we're going to go too far the other way under National, because we're going back to what National had. Nobody seems to have stopped and said, hold on, let's start with a blank page and see what would be best for both parties here. So that concerns me as well. Let's see what Karen's got to say about everything that they did being overturned.
Just before we move on to that point, though, I do think I personally do want to object to this, kind of dichotomy that, people often put forward about, and I think this has a lot. I think this is ultimately one of the root issues with, the way that New Zealand chooses to write, its legislation, particularly around the advent of rent seeking, is this idea that, like tenants and landlords are two equal parties, with equal, sort of levy in their negotiations that are coming to a mutually agreeable outcome in contract. I mean, this notion is just farcical, So I think if you have a look at what the status quo was under the Labor government, the current alternative to the introduction of no-cause evictions is that the owner of the property has to, first of all, have an articulable reason for why they want to carry out, the eviction. So that reason is not only articulable, but they also have to have evidence for that reason. And then
the bathroom wall falling to bits because it's next to a dirt bank.
Exactly. And then they have to, take that information to tribunal. And tenancy tribunal is not, an impossible.
If the tenant chooses to dispute it, I mean, I'm going to be honest, in my case, I didn't dispute it because I kind of knew it was a problem.
Yeah, that's right. So once it goes to tribunal, then, the tenant has the opportunity to basically, put forward I mean, literally just their side of the story, right? And then the onus is on the landlord, because we have to recognize, like, what the landlord is doing when they serve an eviction notice is they're putting someone out to street, right? And, you know, that doesn't mean that the tenant is necessarily, you know, it's going to be impossible for them to find new shelter.
I need a bell to ring to say your time's nearly up.
Oh, fair enough. Okay. Well, anyway, yeah. I mean, displacement versus like, oh, geez, you know, done a bit of damage to the drywall. It just doesn't. These two things don't add up. You know, they can't be put on equal footing like that. Anyway.
Yeah. So let's kick off Kieran's first.
Right throughout every single debate, every announcement, every policy debate, this government has not been upfront with New Zealand when it comes to housing. They have been disingenuous, and this bill is yet another example, the second in the last 2 days. There are aspects of this bill that make sense. There are provisions to encourage landlords to take on tenants with pets, we support. The provisions to allow tenants to withdraw from a tenancy in the case of family violence, we support. But at the core of this bill is that it is easier for landlords to dismiss tenants and make them homeless than it would be otherwise. Right. And that is simply why we cannot support this bill. But, Madam Speaker, in order to fully understand this bill, it's important to understand the broader context of housing debate and housing policy from this government. And that, Madam Speaker, is why I say they are being disingenuous. For the Minister to stand up in the House when introducing this speech and say that there is a consensus on increasing the supply, yet in 7 months have not made a single announcement that will lead to the increase in supply, or i.e., in simple terms, the building of new houses. In fact, what is clear is that the policy changes that this government has made will decrease and disincentivise and lead to fewer houses being built. It is that simple. And that is exactly what this bill will do. And when, Madam Speaker, you consider this bill in the context of things like reintroducing interest deductibility, like what we've seen throughout, I've asked for logic. How about you listen up? Here it is. Taking away interest deductibility made an incentive to invest in new builds, and it was working. If you don't want to listen to this, listen to the evidence. As a result of moving that, we saw an increase in new builds and an increase in new home buyers building the market. And then, oh no, he's changed the subject now, Madam Speaker. Typical National MP, asks the question, gets presented with evidence, doesn't like the answer, so changes the subject. But I tell you what, for the sake of everybody else, I'll continue. We saw investment in new builds rather than contesting between speculators and investors on existing stock. That was driving up house prices. And this bill does nothing to do with that. By changing that, what they've done is they're going to move investment away from new builds and increase speculation on existing stock. That means new home buyers who were entering the market will not. Exactly what happened the last time National were in government. So why is that important in the context of this bill, Madam Speaker? Because when people are able to be kicked out of their home easier, what's going to happen to them? They are going to look for more rentals, or they're going to be homeless. Now, homeless is an interesting part of this debate, Madam Speaker, because this government has made it harder to access emergency housing and easier to be kicked out of Kāinga Ora properties. What is going to happen to them? If there's no houses going to be built, they are going to be homeless. Every way you look at this, Madam Speaker, this leads to more homeless people. The easier it is to kick people out of tenancies, the higher the likelihood that the homeless rate will increase. And it's very simple, Madam Speaker. They can holler, they can bicker, they can shout, they can heckle, but they actually have nothing to refute the fact that their policies last time increased homelessness and increased house prices, and we saw a drop in the build of new builds, of affordable builds, and of social housing. and they follow exactly the same policies, and now they argue that it's going to be a different outcome. It's rubbish. It is disingenuous, and that is the core point of my speech, Madam Speaker, is that they are telling the New Zealand public that something's going to happen that actually isn't, because all evidence and all experience shows that what they're saying is simply not true. That's right. And what they've done is they've packaged this up with the nice and fluffy bits like the pet bonds, and you notice how the minister focused on that for much of his speech, because he knows the guts of this bill is actually going to be unpopular, and the Kiwis can see through it, and they know that this bill...
time is expired.
Okay. Maybe we need to get a recording of that of Barbara Courager doing the same thing for every time we need use on you, Gabriel.
Yeah, I quite like that, actually. That's what I was thinking, too. I think maybe we should introduce that, Sam. Just you holler, members' time has expired.
We'll get the different people in the speaker chair, and then we can sit there and choose which one we play.
Yeah.
So, Rex, how did you find Kieran's reply or argument?
Well, okay. Again, a lot of assertions in there that the rental market shrank under National. If you know that to be a fact, by how much? Give me some figures, because I don't disagree with what he's saying, but the sort of the logical part of my brain, as opposed to the emotional part, is saying, okay, well, feed me some facts on which to support the conclusions that you're asking me to reach. And I would expect the government and the opposition to do a hell of a lot better when there is something as crucial on the table as making people homeless, because this is the effect that this bill could potentially have. I wasn't particularly impressed by that, but then again, I wasn't particularly impressed by Chris Bishop either.
Gabriel?
Yeah, I think I'm going to second that. Like, I feel like this bill is bad enough as it is without having to make what are some pretty large assertions that, look, if you're going to make those assertions, I agree with Rex here. Like, you're going to have to provide, I think, a decent citation for the claims that you're making. I think there's enough like protein, present to sort of like really dismiss the credibility of this bill as is. Another one that I think is really interesting, actually, like all the talk about pet bonds, something that's quite fascinating is that, like, technically landlords can already take pet bonds. However, what you are not allowed to do is the now standard 4 weeks of rent that are taken as bond for a rental property was actually introduced to be a hard limit. So the idea was, at the time that this was introduced, that you can only take up to 4 weeks of rent. Yes. It was kind of more standard to take like a couple of weeks of rent. And then if you want to add on to that for a pet bond, you can take like an extra couple of weeks of rent. But instead, what we saw is, and again, this is very, very typical of this particular sector of society. You give a finger, they take an arm. So as soon as you have this hard limit for up to 4 weeks, which is meant to give room for that pet bond in the first place, the decision is then made like, well, just ask for the 4 weeks, and then everyone asks for that across the board. It becomes the new standard. I also think it's worth noting that when Chris Bishop himself was mentioning the situation in Queenstown in particular, which is a housing situation that I am all too familiar with, being that close to that part of the country, his bringing up that people would rather choose to Airbnb certain properties than make them available for people to live in, and then pointing to some of these really quite reasonable legislative requirements that we have to afford tenants at least some basic rights with regards to their shelter, and then pointing to those basic rights as being the issue rather than the fact that like Airbnb itself has been considered by a lot of municipalities around the world as being a net loss to their economy and their housing stability and their housing market. And so what a lot of very similar jurisdictions have chosen to do with Airbnb is to decide that, look, it doesn't actually have a place within the accommodation market, of a particular like town or tourist industry, or if it does, in a very regulated, very tightly controlled sense. But that's obviously not something we're going to see from that side of the house. Instead, what we're going to see is a justification of the harms that a system like Airbnb causes to an accommodation market, and using that to basically excuse the further degradation of an already fairly basic and minimal set of rights for people that are forced to rent. And the last thing I wanted to acknowledge before my time expires is this notion of the National loves to talk about the mom and dad landlord, and how they're just these small little. Here's the thing. First of all, mom and dad landlords, generally speaking, tend to be the worst landlords in the country. Second only probably to Kainga Ora, which I've got my own very, very strong views about.
Yeah.
But the reality is, a lot of these, like small landlords and small investors, first of all, like being small doesn't make you harmless. That's another really important thing, right? Like when someone's shelter is in your hands and you have this disproportionate level of power, the fact that you only have one family's life in your hands as opposed to 10 doesn't make the situation any better. No. But not only that, the reality behind a lot of these mom and dad landlords is that they often do not have the equity required to actually even be a landlord in the first place. So instead, what they try and do is they try and fall back on these really quite crude pressure tactics to move people on from properties that ask for the bare minimum, like, hey, I don't think this is complying, or, look, I think there might be a legitimate issue with the fact that you've put a padbolt instead of a proper doorknob on this door. Like if there's a fire, that's a very specific example from something I experienced recently. I think that this whole notion of like the mom and dad landlord as being like, harmless.
And it's also been evident, like there was one particular landlord in Nelson who wanted to charge his tenant a $5,000 bond because that was his insurance excess.
It's insane.
And that was actually and that was more than 4 times what the rent is. And something useful to know is now I'm not sure if it has changed recently, as in like the last 2 years, but work and income's bond limit without managerial approval was up until about 2020 was still $600 to get a bond. The thing is, it was something like 95% of bond applications had to go to manager approval to be signed off because it was written at a point in time where 2 weeks rent was standard as the normal bond thing, not 4. So it was something in there, and also at a point where you would rent possibly a 3-bedroom house for $150 a week, which I think Rex's friend Ray Wallace sat there and said to me, I'd like a 4-bedroom house, sit there and do it. And he said, get a time machine and go back to 1990 and I can get you one for $100,000.
Yeah. It's a bit like and just last thing too as well. Like it's a bit like the accommodation supplement. What National very crudely proposed is the alternative to the public housing stock they absolutely destroyed. Following the Bolger government. The accommodation supplement. The maximum that it will subsidize, they have like a tiered, a sort of tiered list. So like if your rent is
based on zones,
it's based on the cost of the rent. It maxes out that the cost of the rent, the most expensive rent that work and income in Invercargill, for example, can fathom, because it's different throughout the country. It's like $250 a week.
Exactly. Put it this example. When I was in Levin on the unemployment benefit, and my friend Brian was on the unemployment benefit in Wellington, we got the same. So we both had $150 rent on there. We got the same dollar figure, but our makeups of benefits were very different. And because I had $30 worth of temporary additional support payments put on, because I was paying excessive rent, because $132 a week was deemed excessive under that system, they gave me $18 a week temporary additional support. But if I went to earn income, I lost that $18 from the first dollar I earned. Whereas if Brian went to work, he could earn up to $80 before his benefit got touched.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a classic example of what do you call it, of an unintended consequence from different packages. Let's move on to Wellington Central MP Tamitha Paul. She brings up some very good points in the starting statement.
The government is introducing dramatic changes to rental laws in Aotearoa, and I want to be very clear about what these changes mean for ordinary New Zealanders. So at a time where homelessness, lower rents, I'll get back to you on how that actually goes as a renter. At a time where homelessness is increasing and more people are rough sleeping on the streets and in their cars, at a time where public housing projects for thousands of homes are being cancelled and delayed because those people cannot guarantee sustainable funding, at a time where families are trying to raise their families in motels and backpackers, where you have 16 people overcrowding in 3-bedroom houses and where children are routinely admitted to hospital because their homes are making them sick because they are that mouldy and that damp, that our government has chosen to prioritise making it easier for landlords to kick tenants out of their own homes. Not building more houses, not committing to sustainable funding to allow for more housing to be built, not making renting more secure or reducing the discrimination that renters face when trying to find a home, but making it easier for landlords to kick people out of their homes with no reason at all. Because regardless of whether you have been the best tenant in the world, regardless of the value you have added to your home by maintaining it or even improving it, and regardless of whether your whānau has settled into the communities that you have built roots in, your landlord can kick you out for no reason at all. And this is on top of the billions of dollars of tax cuts that this government is giving to landlords. And it makes me wonder who is being served by this government. Is it purely landlords? And what else do you expect when you elect a leader of a government who owns 7 houses at a time where people can't even make their rent? And Minister Bishop would have you believe that good tenants don't get kicked out. And this is a statement by a minister that is so deeply out of touch with the reality for average New Zealanders. Because I put out a call asking good tenants to share times that they had been unfairly evicted and received over 500 responses in less than 24 hours. And I want to share, you wish you had this level of social media engagement. The stories included this one. I lived alone. Yeah, true story, first one there. Next one. I lived alone, paid rent on time, kept my home tidy, cozy and maintained, worked full-time as a senior analyst in a government ministry. My landlord threatened me with eviction on multiple occasions for the following reasons: asking her to lodge my bond, asking to move in on the date that was set out in my rental tenancy agreement, keeping a small compost bin, and asking for the full 48 hours notice of inspections. Here's another story. My children had 12 homes by the age of 14. Many of them were houses that the landlord was selling, or I chose to go into other houses as they were better suited to find out that they would be sold in 6 months' time. This can't be the country that we're living in, where every single housing avenue for ordinary New Zealanders, whether that is private rentals or public housing, is insecure, unaffordable and unattainable. And the consequences of kicking people out for no good reason is this: constantly having to pay moving companies to move houses multiple times in a year. And if you can even afford a moving company, then you might have, if you can't afford a moving company, you have to move the stuff yourself, which is impossible, impractical and unaffordable for seniors and for people with disabilities. Having to continuously re-enroll your kids in different schools because your new rental is in a different school zone. Moving those kids around schools is extremely unsettling for them and makes it harder for them to make friends and achieve in school. It means people are less confident in enforcing their rights, and it means worse health impacts and costs to our already under-resourced public health system. I'll close by saying this: renters deserve better, and I have no doubt that they will rise up and kick this government out in 2 years' time for these actions.
mentioned some very good parts about not doing the basics and being threatened with eviction. It's I've seen that personally as well in the different help groups, and I mean
I'm experiencing that literally right now.
Yeah, Rex, you've been very quiet. Let's get your.
Well, again, a lot of anecdote, personal anecdote this time, and okay. I wish somebody would come up with some statistics, but I guess we're not going to get any out of our parliamentarians. But one thing about that speech was I wish all MPs could make that speech. I think to not have had lived experience of anything really that you're voting about, but certainly things that are this important to this many people in this country, almost should disqualify you. Because if you don't know what it's like to be a tenant, to some degree, perhaps if you don't know what it's like to be a landlord, probably one or the other. What are you doing in the debate? Tabitha Paul at least knows what it's like, and I think all of us that have rented have been in similar situations. But I have to agree that I have had some very, very good landlords. I also have to point out that if we didn't have any landlords, then we would have more homelessness, because as she said, we don't have enough social housing, and no government has committed to building social housing. The last Labor government refused capital gains and a wealth tax, which could have given them some revenue to use for that, if that's what they wanted to do with it. So really nobody stepped up to the plate and tried to fix the problem. And so we can thrash landlords all we like, but they're just a sad fact of existence until there is a surplus of houses, and then the power comes back on to the people who want to be tenants. I'd happily be a tenant if I could afford a place that was warm and comfortable. I've got this big house, I've got a huge garden. I don't want all that. I've got better things to do. I'd rather rent a little apartment, but not for $750 a week. That's crazy, and that's probably the best I could do. So, what she said, I think, is very, very pertinent. The problem comes down to there's not enough houses for the people that need housing. And if we had that answered, we'd suddenly wipe all these problems with landlords, because the people who wanted to have a home could pick and choose between buying, renting, and who they rented with.
Yeah. Quite a good example of what you got on there, and you've got the point right. Like, you're in a house that's bigger than your needs, because renting is ridiculously stupid. And I'd hate to know, is your rates bill hitting 5 digits yet or not?
Don't get me started on the Hutt City Council and our wonderful Labor Mayor Campbell Barry and his team of lawyers, who will no doubt contact me again as soon as I say something they don't like. But yes, rates are ridiculous in the Hutt Valley, and from what I hear, they rose for me last time anyway, 18%, and they are going to rise again, I think somewhere closer to 20%. So it's getting to the point where that, along with the fact that because I'm seen to be in Lower Hutt, even though there's a monstrous Wainuiomata Hill between me and the Valley Basin, the insurance company uses that as an excuse to say I'm at sudden risk of a tsunami, which would have to literally submerge the entire planet to affect my house, and other things that are affecting areas like Tony and that are obviously near the sea. When I look at the cost of insurance and rates, then it's starting to make renting look more attractive. But again, I think there's probably landlords in that position that again are being preyed upon by insurance companies, and that again is another topic that you probably don't want to start me on.
I think there's a lot of things that could be changed with the insurance industry, and I think if they're trying to sit there and say that Wainuiomata is a tsunami zone, I'd love to know what size that metre of that tsunami is going to be coming up Coast Road, because that's probably the flattest route to probably swamp out your house.
Look, I mean, honestly, if there's a tidal wave coming to hit my house, then we've got bigger problems than our insurance premiums. To be quite honest, we're in a sort of end of the world situation.
Yeah, an act of God, Gabrielle.
Yeah, look, I think what's worth pointing out is that it wasn't all that long ago that the UK did away with landlords entirely. Like residential rent seeking. Again, I've got a pretty set it's not really even an opinion. I think just an acknowledgement of a reality that there is no net gain either to an economy or to a worker. It really only benefits people that don't want to work for a living. Let's be completely honest. And look, I think that the reality behind rent seeking as a behavior and as a phenomenon, this kind of notion that of it being a necessary evil. Like personally, I think it's completely unnecessary. In fact, if you look at the way that New Zealand used to provision its housing, and I think that's really, really important, right? Is what is your model for housing in a society? And I think the way that New Zealand used to provision its housing, for a lot of workers in New Zealand, it used to be part of even their remuneration schemes. Under the really strong trade union systems. You have a look at, I've spoken to plenty of people that used to work, for the old railway system or the Ministry of Works. And shelter was part and parcel of the work that they were commissioned to carry out and do. The entire town of Twizel was literally built, to house the workers that were creating, the hydroelectric infrastructure for New Zealand at that time. And I think that, there is no, landlords, certainly not in the retail market rent seeking sense, in that equation. And I think the reason why, New Zealand is in such a poorly state with regards to shelter and with regards to housing is that I think because we had a history of a country with really strong, like labor protections, collective bargaining rights, and a generally quite equitable society, the reforms of the 80s, which obviously, we weren't the only country in the world to be subjected to these radical reforms. Obviously the US had its Reagan, the UK had its Thatcher. We had a double whammy with, Roger Douglas and then Bolger, who, and Ruth Richardson, who seems to make things 10 times worse. I think that's placed New Zealand in a particularly bad spot with regards to housing. And that's the reason why statistically New Zealand's housing inflation seems to be so much higher than other comparable OECD countries that have had similar reforms. So no, definitely look, personally, I'm not convinced by the notion of landlords being a necessary evil. I think evil is just enough to describe this situation and the phenomenon. And I think that the current government's approach, an attitude towards rent seekers, giving them, literally basing the entire national budget around how you can further accommodate, an economic phenomenon that is actually costing New Zealand obscene amounts of money, is just absurd, but my time has expired.
Anything else you want to add, Rex?
No, I think we've done a quite a good job of covering it. I think we're in broad agreement. I perhaps don't have the same, quite as low an opinion of landlords as some, but I think the problem is housing, and that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about housing, and what has anybody done about housing? It is now either saying that the answer is 90-day evictions or saying that the answer isn't. I'd like to hear them talk about how they're going to solve the housing crisis, and really they don't.
Yeah. Okay. Now I'm back to saying this is the voice of reason. Andy Foster's speech is very interesting. It's interesting because he keeps using the term, let's use the submission process to find the right balance.
Thanks, Madam Speaker. Look, we've heard quite a lot of hyperbole already in this debate and how radical the discussion that we're having is. But the reality is we've actually had this discussion before in this House, probably not that long ago, when the roles were reversed and the direction of the legislation was reversed. So it's not particularly radical. And this is something which was signalled quite clearly in the campaign, signalled quite clearly in the coalition agreement, that this is the thing that the government was going to do. And the government is doing exactly what it said. And I look across the House there and say, you guys should try that, because it would have done you a lot better than some of the things that you did actually do when there were a lot of hidden agendas that you didn't tell the public about and you then proceeded to embark upon.
Not you, Mr. Foster. Don't use the word you.
Oh, sorry, Madam Speaker. It wasn't you. It wasn't
okay,
about the Speaker at all. But Madam Speaker, we've been accused of being disingenuous by the Honourable Kieran McNulty. But this is very, very clear. This is exactly what we said we were going to do, and it's exactly what we are doing. It's interesting when you read the RAS, there is a clear difference between the submissions which were made by the landlords and people representing landlords and people representing and the tenants. Clear difference between those two parties. about what the best arrangements are between them. And it's also clear that the advice that we're getting actually is nuanced. And there is no parallel universe to test the advice and say, well, if you do it this way, it's going to work better than this way, or if you do it this way, it's going to work better. So it's this one is a balancing act. And obviously on that side of the house, they're falling on one side of the argument. On this side of the house, we're falling on the other side. But the great thing here is what we're going to do is we're going to go out to the public with this piece of legislation, and we'll give the opportunity for the public to have their say. And what I hope is instead of going backwards and forwards, somewhere we might have the collective wisdom to be able to find the right arrangement. Because the reality is that the vast majority, if we had good tenants and good landlords, we wouldn't need to be involved in this at all. And the vast majority of people are good tenants and good landlords. But there are some who are not. And sometimes the tenant needs to be protected against the landlord. Sometimes the landlord needs to be protected against the tenant. And we heard over there from the Green Party that so often, tenants are kicked out for no reason. But why would you kick, as a landlord, why would you kick a good tenant out? What is the purpose of doing that? If they're a good tenant, they're paying their rent, they're not damaging your property, why would you kick them out? That is completely stupid. That is completely stupid and is against your best interest. Look, Madam Speaker, we know that the Labor Party didn't set out to demonise landlords, but the reality is you look at the kind of legislation they've passed, you look at the approach they've taken, and time again from that side of the House we're hearing the arguments about against the deduction of interest against the costs of running a business, and every other business is able to do that. But poor landlords, they're not able to do it, according to that side of the House. There's something wrong with that. But while they didn't probably set out to demonise landlords, what it looks like is that's exactly what they are doing. And the funny thing is that what landlords are doing is they've responded to that and they have withdrawn from the market. And the funny thing is that what that has done is it has driven up rental costs. So it's actually not been in the best interest of the tenants. So what I'm saying is that we need to find a balance and find a way through this, and that is exactly what the idea of the legislation is to do, because it opens up the conversation again to be had. Madam Speaker, a good tenant to a landlord is worth their weight in gold. It gives you security. It means that you know that your property, the hard-earned money that you put into that property, is going to be looked after well. It means you know that there is going to be a secure income coming against that property. I cannot see why a good tenant will be kicked out by a good landlord. This legislation, the legislation which we're removing, the legislation which we're bringing in, really is about dealing with the problem relationships which there are from time to time. And if all relationships are good, we wouldn't need to be involved in this. The problem is that they are not. The debate's been had, and sadly, we're all going to have to do it all over again. So my appeal to submitters and my appeal to us in this House is to see if we can find a middle ground that is a sustainable way forward for both landlords and tenants and for New Zealand Inc. Because if we don't do it, it is not going to be good for anybody. The final thing I'd like to say in the last few seconds I've got, Kieran McNulty said that, talked about house building. And the reason that house building has dropped off is a very simple one. It's the economy. The cost of building has gone up like that. The value of houses went down like that. Well, what do you expect to happen? And lots of developers have pulled out of the market simply because they cannot make the numbers work. Similarly, a lot of landlords have pulled out because they can't make the numbers work with the kind of regime that is in place at the moment and without that interest deductibility. I commend this bill to the House.
Oh boy.
Does it feel like Andy's trying to play one on each side?
Nah, I don't buy it. And I say this as somebody who.
Don't remember, I do know Andy.
That's fair enough. Look, I say this as someone who backed New Zealand First, and I do, and the reason for that was very specific, right? Like, it was pretty much a given that Labour's on their way out. And to be fair, I don't think I could ever back the Labour Party for my own reasons, nor the Green Party. I mean, but anyway, yeah. Look, the reason I backed New Zealand First with this particular election was because, if nothing else, I knew that Winston being a part of the coalition agreement would mean that the reintroduction of foreign buyers into the market was not something that he was going to accept. So I did at the very least get my vote's worth out of that very, very crucial aspect of the coalition agreement. But look, what I think is so profoundly telling about that member's speech is he points out developers can't make the numbers work. He's saying that we're not building enough housing. because of the state of the economy, and he's saying developers can't make the numbers work and landlords can't make the numbers work, so they choose to exit the rental market, which again, I still think is not that much to cry about. Although with the gap that we have around the construction of housing, like this to me is actually the proof in the pudding by admission of the member that the way in which we provision housing in New Zealand is fundamentally broken. What does a developer do? They are speculating, right? Speculative capital is what housing has become. And under poor market conditions, under poor retail and private market conditions, speculative capital struggles to justify the construction of housing, and so it doesn't. Notwithstanding the fact that the housing they were building beforehand anyway was not affordable worker housing. It was primarily and predominantly luxury housing, developments in Queenstown, large multi-million-dollar duplexes and suplexes, because that's where the money for builders is, in a speculative market, in a private retail housing market. So no, ultimately, look, I don't find it surprising that construction is down, given that the way New Zealand has primarily chosen to fund the construction of its housing stock is by means of speculative capital. And look, the reality is, very rarely, if ever, is affordable housing to shelter workers a profitable endeavor. As far as I'm concerned, I honestly think it's not that dissimilar to our infrastructure. It's an investment that, we don't expect a concrete fiduciary return on a balance sheet from, but we recognize that it's an important and essential service to the welfare of a nation, period. And even from an economic perspective, look at Queenstown. Queenstown is struggling to provision a large number of its core tourism services because a lot of its staff literally cannot afford to live in Queenstown. And then when very minor suggestions are brought to that local council, for example, there was a proposition not too long ago that any new developments, they had to contribute a certain percentage of their budget toward the construction of social housing so that the region could continue to have workers staffing its tourism establishments. All of a sudden, the developers wanted to point the finger at the hospitality industry for not paying their workers enough to afford the ridiculously expensive housing they built in the first place, which I'll be honest, if multimillionaires are talking about the unfair compensation of workers, I think we should maybe take a pause and see what's actually going on there. I can't really accept the members sort of trying to play both sides like that. I think ultimately the root issue here is the commodification of housing, and until New Zealand is willing to confront that difficult reality and even just look to its past to see the way we did things before that actually worked, this issue is not going to get any better by just taking more rights away from tenants. It doesn't really make sense. Anyway,
I think you've given my using that as a thing there, and it does feel you've accurately described, I think, Chris Laidlaw, who said if there was an issue, Chris Laidlaw will find a fence to sit on that issue. Not sure if that was something you've been in the business a lot longer, Rex, but was that something that was kind of always heard when it came to Chris Laidlaw?
Yeah, pretty much. There was a lot of hope riding on his shoulders, and it very quickly evaporated. But that was an interesting speech from Andy Foster. I love the we. Clearly, he's bought into the being the part of the coalition, and I would think is probably looking for a safe national seat somewhere in the next election, by the sounds of his enthusiasm for the government as a whole.
In Karori, where he lives.
Yeah. Well, possibly. Whereas I'm sure that his leader will have a little bit of a chat with him about differentiating themselves from National, because that's what they're going to need to do at the next election. But look, anyway, one thing he conveniently overlooked was that things were made a heck of a lot easier for developers by the decision by both National and Labour. So nobody else, of course, got a look in the last term, which was to basically do away with zoning for councils. Councils councils could no longer prevent the building of what I have to say are modern day slums. And I've had a look at a lot of these the developments, and I mean, who wants a balcony? Lovely. I've lived in apartments, love my balcony, not one that's a metre away from somebody else's balcony. So you can actually reach across and shake hands with your neighbour. It's ridiculous. And of course, you've got no light coming into that narrow well between the apartments. I'd rather see them go up than go out like that. And that's what's happening, certainly all around Lower Hutt. And so you can take a section now that one house used to occupy, and you can build 8, 10, 12, depending on how small you're prepared to go, properties on there. And so don't shed any tears for developers. The thing that is affecting developers, and I'm here, I know a couple, they're smaller developers, I have to say, they're not the big corporate ones. They just do one project at a time, is what councils are taking from them in terms of development fees. Adding one property to the back of your section. I've got a huge section here that thankfully my father had the foresight to plant half of it in trees, so I've got a small forest at the back that could easily be occupied by another home. But before I even start, I would have to pay the Hutt City Council something like $125,000 to get a permit, maybe in 8 months if I'm lucky, probably a lot longer than that. That's a problem.
And that's just to sit down there and split your section from one to basically split your section into half.
Yeah, that's right. And for them to come back and then tell me, well, you need to put in more drains and obvious
so part
stuff.
of that 125 grand doesn't actually pay to sit there and even lay an extra pipe from the road to the new site.
Oh, no, look, I've got a development next door to me, and that's how I know one of the developers, and he was very considerate during the whole process. He's got his family home, which he no longer lives in, he rents out, is right at the front of the property. So he's managed to get 3 freestanding sort of A-frame buildings. I'm looking out the window at one now. They're very good. They don't block any sunlight or anything from my section. I've got no problem with them at all. He had a nightmare with the council, not just the money. There's a right of way down the middle of our 2 properties, and he was going to turn that into the driveway for the 3 homes. I mean, that's the other thing is now the streets are full of cars because the developers no longer have to provide parks for people. So he was going to do that. He put in the at his own expense. He put in the driveway, whatever they call it, the concrete that you drive across the berm on. And then council turned up and said, "Nah, you're not allowed a driveway there anymore. And by the way, you can't leave that ugly eyesore. Rip it all up and replace it with turf." That's a small thing, but this is the kind of nonsense that I would call developers with their hearts in the right place, because he's now provided 3 lovely family homes there, are having to go on with council.
New customers to the Hutt City Council ratepayer base?
Exactly. Well, I don't know whether they've been sold. I think he had trouble selling them because he built them just before the property crash. So now I think they're being leased out. They were intended to be sold as family homes. I don't know what's become of all of them. So developers are facing nonsense rules and regulations from council still, but on the other hand, they can go and build, slums one next to the other. The other thing I want to say about councils is well, perhaps both of you are too young to remember the time when councils had houses. They built houses. They rented out houses. My grandma ended her days in a lovely council flat and paying next to nothing for them. Council said, "Oh, look, some assets we can sell," and the whole market just went to heck. So they're making all that money. Put the responsibility back on the councils.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
Actually, Wellington City Council had their council housing. Some of it was part of the remuneration package to house their staff. And if we also look on the legacy pre-2018 bus routes for Wellington City, all the bus routes went past all the council houses, which was a hangover from pre-89 when the city council owned and controlled the buses, not the regional council.
Yeah. No, yeah, I think that's amazing. And I'm totally with you, Rex. Council housing to me is obviously it's not the only answer, But it's a little bit like, I mean, to be fair, the housing crisis, right, I think is in many ways actually much more avoidable than, what any of us would care to admit, particularly those with vested interest in keeping it going. And I'm not going to pretend that council housing is, the silver bullet, the be all end all to make, all the issues go away. But I do think that it is a very achievable, very important part of that puzzle. And it's a very sensible investment, because ultimately, I mean, people that live in a city and that work and pay taxes in a city, even if they themselves are not necessarily paying rates by means of property, but are still, creating and generating value for that township, is only a good investment. And it is with that, gentlemen, I also have to say, I think my time for today has expired, which I'm really gutted about, because I think the next discussion was really interesting. I mean, that's another thing I love is the tension between, civic identity and ethnic identity. And, that very much something that
you're talking about Māori wards.
Yes, very much. So, I mean, I've definitely got some, I'm a one person, one vote kind of guy with keeping the treaty in mind and how to interpret Article 2. So look, I'm really gutted I can't be part of that discussion today. But I really appreciate being a part of the discussion around housing today. Thank you so much for having me on.
No problem. Thanks for joining us.
No worries. We'll see you guys later.
See you later. Bye. And actually, that mentions a good point about the car park aspect, because how far away, Rex, are you from a public transport?
Well, I've got a bus stop at the door on both sides of the road, so I'm pretty good in terms of accessibility to it. The only problem that I have is they've knocked the bus stops down, so I have to hold on to the pole most days to stop from being blown down the road. And the other thing is, they're once an hour, which is not necessarily convenient, because they tend to come on the hour. People tend to just naturally say, oh, we'll meet at 3, we'll meet at 2. So if I had a 3 o'clock meeting, I'd get on the 2 o'clock bus. I'd be deposited in the Hutt Valley probably around 2:20, and I'd have to kill 40 minutes before the meeting started, and then again, possibly kill another 40 to come home again on the bus. So they're not coming from a city in Perth where they have rapid transport for free with electric buses coming every 15 minutes past the front door of my apartment. It's just.
Were they trolley buses back then, or were they actual battery electric buses?
In Perth, no, they're battery buses. They're called CAT buses for no, I've forgotten what it's called now. Central area transport, I think. They're quite small buses that hold maybe 20 people, but every 15 minutes it doesn't matter, and they're zooming around all the time, and you jump on, jump off wherever you like, and they cost nothing. So who wouldn't use them? So we've got away from this problem of the costs going up, or arguing about the costs, or arguing about subsidies or whatever. It's just there, and it makes for a better city because you don't have all the transport going into the city all the time. Perth is a very livable city now, and the Hutt Valley Wellington probably will never have that, but the Hutt Valley could easily be with some central area transport going on. But again, instead of building houses, we're building our 6th swimming pool. That's right, 6 for 100,000 people at the cost of $68 million, because our mayor wants something to cut a ribbon. Sorry?
Where's the 6th swimming pool going? Because I thought there was Wainui pools, the Mackenzie ones, Uia and Nainai.
Yep. Well, Nainai was condemned for being unsafe in earthquakes, which, okay, if that were true, and I earthquake standards are a whole nother thing for debate. I think they're way too finicky. But even if that were true, all you really got is a barn over the pools. Knock down the barn. No, the Hutt City Council has to dig up the pool, replace absolutely everything, and so they're spending $68 million. Now think of all the council housing that could build. Think of the rapid transport buses that could bring about, all the things that they claim to care about.
Gerard Cooper actually brought up in there. He's worked for bus companies for years. We worked out if there was a simple change to the bus timetables for the bus routes, the high frequencies that in the Hutt, which are 15 minutes apart, if they were shifted to 10 minutes, it would cost $1.3 million extra a year. And when you divide that down to the ratepayers per household, it worked out to be something like $1 a week. and that would actually sit down there and have buses line up with the trains that are on a 20-minute timetable on the railway line. So quite intriguing that. Now we're going to jump over to Thursday and see the MP for Pakuranga, who has a 6-lane monstrosity with no median barrier or anything down it to get to his electorate. That's what I sit there and call it, considering Wellington's 6-lane monstrosity called Jervis Key actually has some trees down the middle. And this is about the Māori electoral it was the electoral legislation of Māori wards and Māori constituency amendment bill.
Constituencies Amendment Bill.
That legislative statement is published under the authority of the House and can be found on the parliamentary website. Honourable Simeon Brown.
Mr Speaker, I move that the Local Government Electoral Legislation and Māori Wards and Māori Constituencies Amendment Bill be now read a first time. I nominate the Justice Committee to consider the bill. At the appropriate time, I intend to move that the bill be reported to the House by 21 June 2024 and that the committee have authority to meet at any time while the House is sitting, except during oral questions, during any evening on a day on which there has been a sitting of the House, on a Friday in a week in which there has been a sitting of the House, and outside the Wellington area, despite Standing Orders 193, 195 and 196. Mr Speaker, I'm pleased to be here today with this local electoral bill. This bill will contribute to the further strengthening our local democracy by reintroducing polls on the establishment of Māori wards, requiring councils to hold a poll at the 2025 local elections if they did not hold a poll prior to establishing that ward, and making changes to the local...
And we'll just like to welcome, we have new panellists who's joined us, Paul Barlow. Paul, Rex.
Hello.
Nice to meet you, Rex.
Yep, we'll continue going in there. Thanks for jumping in since Gabriel's had to finish his day and get back to work.
Electoral calendar to enable the 2025 local elections to be delivered. Mr Speaker, in 2021, the previous government removed the binding polls that councils had to hold if they received a valid petition to decide on whether Māori wards would be established in their constituencies. By doing so, they also silenced local voices who overwhelmingly voted against it when consulted. We oppose the bill because we support the idea that local people in their local communities should be the ones who make the decisions on how they wish to be represented. Mr Speaker, this government is committed to local democracy. We're not removing the right to establish Māori wards. However, we want each local community to decide whether they want one or not. That is a decision for local people and local communities to make about their local representation. Under this bill, councils will once again be able to resolve to hold binding polls on Māori wards, and communities will be able to petition their local council to hold one if a council resolves that they don't want to hold a binding one in the first place. Binding polls will be restored with the same policy settings as they were prior to 2021, including a petition from 5% of electors on a council's roll at the last local elections will require the council to hold a binding poll. Any person on the electoral roll for a council will be able to vote. A simple majority will bind a council to the outcome, and the outcome of the poll will be binding on a council for the next 2 local government elections. The bill will also remove the requirement under the Local Government Electoral Legislation Act 2023 for councils to consider Māori wards every 6 years during the representation reviews if they have not yet established Māori wards. Since removing the binding poll mechanism in 2021, 45 councils decided to establish a Māori ward without having a poll. That is 45 councils where local communities, electors, did not get a direct say on whether they wanted Māori wards or not. This bill gives those local authorities the choice between 2 options. The council can choose themselves to unmake the ward, or they can hold a binding poll at the upcoming 2025 local elections. These options will give the council the opportunity to avoid holding a poll if they consider that is the right choice for their community. The result of these polls will take effect at the 2028 local elections. The exception to this is Tauranga City Council, which is holding their local elections on the 20th of July, less than 2 months away, and before this bill will be passed. Tauranga City Council will instead be given the same options as other councils to either hold a poll before the 2028 elections or to disestablish the ward for the 2028 election. We want Māori voices to be heard and represented. We also know Māori wards are not the only way to give Māori a voice in New Zealand. In fact, Mr Speaker, you may recall that the Kaikoura Council unanimously voted no to establishing a Māori ward and instead decided to continue to work in partnership with Mana Whenua to investigate other options of greater inclusion in council decision-making. The Local Government Act also requires local authorities to have processes in place for consulting with Māori in accordance with the principles of consultation under the Act. We expect on this side of the House that local councils will continue to engage with Māori as they have previously when it comes to the matters that affect them. And, Mr Speaker, we also respect the fact that voters will be able to have their say. And in some communities, they may well decide to keep the Māori wards. They may well keep them, and that is up to the voters in those local communities. And even prior to the 2021 change, councils had binding polls and had appointed and had voted, and those communities had voted to support those wards. And so, Mr Speaker, I say to members on the other side of the House, what have they got to be afraid of with democracy? What have they got to be afraid of with democracy? Ultimately, the public having their say. Every 3 years, we're privileged enough to live in a democracy in New Zealand and to vote for vote for our government. And every 3 years, we're privileged enough to be in a democracy and vote for local councils, for mayors and councillors and community board members to represent us in our communities. But there are some decisions which ultimately we leave to voters to be able to make and to decide upon. And generally those decisions are constitutional decisions. And whether it's a parliamentary term or whether it's the type of voting system, we allow the voters of New Zealand to have their say on those matters. And it's the same when it comes to local councils. When a council is deciding whether to make a significant constitutional change to put in place Māori wards, ultimately they should be able to let the public have their say on what is a significant change in their local community. And I say again to the people on the other side of this House, what should they be afraid of when it comes to democracy?
I think we've gathered enough of what Simeon said. This is annoying when it's the first speech. It can go on for up to 10 minutes. I've got a proposal. I want to get my friends from Northern Ward, from Central Ward, Eastern Ward and Western Ward who aren't represented by community boards to veto the Wainui-a-Mata Community Board. The law does not allow me to do that, and as Rex would probably quite understand what I'm mentioning just there.
Yeah.
You know?
There's a lot of foibles in the law like that, it's very, very difficult to wade in on this issue, not being a part of the tangata whenua. But, you know, I think I can because I don't have a problem with it. If we have Maori seats, why not have Maori seats on council? What concerns me more is that, in fact, we don't have a Maori seat on the Hutt City Council, and the mayor in particular and his cronies on the council have a lot of how do I put this without getting us all sued? A lot of people with whom they consult, and suddenly decisions are made on the basis of this consultation, supposedly having told them all they need to know. So I'd much rather it be an open consultation with representatives of Maori or whoever else around a council table, and I think this is perhaps a way of implementing that.
Okay, yeah, Paul.
I find this absolutely fascinating because the language used is very careful to basically sea lion the idea of you should believe in democracy. What do you mean you don't believe in democracy? This is totally democratic. You should totally believe in democracy. I don't understand why you have a problem with democracy by not letting people choose whether or not they have Māori wards. But the fact is, our country's constitutional basis is one document, which is an agreement between the Crown and Māori, which guaranteed them the right to self-determination. And by saying to the wider public, do you think Māori should have that right when it comes to decision-making around your local councils? That's breaching the very part of the treaty that was set up to look after making sure they had that right of self-determination. It is a disingenuous argument, and it's often pushed by people who want to say, oh, democracy, democracy, but it ignores a whole bunch of factors that come into play, like who actually votes in local body elections. Traditionally, you're looking at around 44 to 45% of people voting in local body elections. As an average, it's lower for city councils than it is for things like district councils or regional councils. Of those that vote, the majority of them tend to be people over the age of 55, Pākehā, and owning property. And even if you look at the stats of people who own property who vote, the numbers are well down for Māori in particular. Everything is set up so that if this vote goes out to the wider public, that the thumbs are already on the scales to make sure it doesn't get the result of allowing Māori wards to go through. It has the problem that it whips up racial disharmony along the way, and it is quite clearly a breach of the right of self-determination.
Something that actually got mentioned about the Kapiti Coast District Council consultation on Māori wards was the amount of submissions against it were based on fiction rather than fact. And that was something that I remember hearing Sean Plunkett on the platform going, well, because he interpreted submission as a referendum, which is completely separate thing again, but saying, but you've ignored these opinions. But there, and I think Lawrence Kirby, who was on there, didn't actually do some justice on there to sit there and say many of these negative submissions weren't based on fact. Now, if we had Judge Judy presiding over the submission process instead of saying a bunch of councillors, she would be yelling out, what you call baloney, you're an idiot, you don't know how principles work. You can picture her response to the process. And
here's an interesting one for you when it comes to that disinformation, Sam. Last week, the ACT Party put out in their Free Press newsletter about this particular law change, stating, quote, at last it will mean one person, one vote in local democracy. And that's never not been the case when it comes to people voting in Māori wards. They vote on the Māori electoral roll for people who...
They can't vote on their general counterpart at the same time. I mean, that's never been the case. And actually, one person, one vote is a complete crock of shit when it comes to multi-member positions. Unless you're going to use STV as your voting system, it is a crock of shit. I mean, Rex, how many votes do you get for... because you're in an FFP council, but your multi-member seats, you get more than one tick, don't you?
We have councillors at large, and we have ward councillors. So we do. I guess you could say we have more than one vote. I mean,
it'll be more like one position, one vote, rather than one person, one vote.
Yeah,
but if multiple local body authorities, you can vote in more than one place. That is one person with more than one vote.
Yeah.
And that's not coming up here for discussion because this government already had the bill drawn and threw it out. But they're quite willing, particularly the ACT Party, are quite willing to use that bullshit line that Māori have got more rights than you do, which is, it's just spreading so much racist crap out there that it becomes almost impossible to fight it.
Yeah, and Ron Mark actually brought this one particularly up for Carterton District Council. If they introduced a Māori ward, because there are only 800 people, of the Māori electoral population in Carterton, they would have one ward with one councillor with one vote, and then the general ward will have 7 councillors, and each general ward voter will have 7 votes for those 7 general ward positions, which he said throws the one person, one vote argument out the window. And part of the reason why he says that particular council, he doesn't support it because what it would bring up. Yeah.
It can work the other way when you look at those sort of statistics. If you've got a very small Maori population and they get one councillor around the table, then that might be one, let's say, a ratio of 1 to 100. Whereas a large Pākehā population with 5 councillors, you might have a ratio of 500 to 1 councillor. But I don't really think that matters too much. It's the way local authorities are run anyway. You tend to get tickets or cliques or whatever you want to call them that band together. And I can see, for instance, if we had a Maori representative on the Lower Hutt City Council, I know damn well whose side that they would be on, and it wouldn't make a blind bit of difference, quite frankly, to the way things are decided around the council table.
Yeah. Okay, shall we move on to, ironically, Kieran McAnulty's reply? Seems to be having a bit of a popular day on the order paper. Got to say the right name. I'm in 2 brand name mode.
Honourable Kieran McAnulty.
Is nothing short of appalling. The speech made by the Minister was nothing short of disingenuous, and the entire rationale behind this bill is racially motivated. It is a disgrace, an absolute disgrace. To stand up in this House and present this to be about democracy when the changes apply only to Māori wards and not about any other aspect of it. That's right. Simeon Brown should be ashamed. Be ashamed for giving in to extreme elements for the sake of a cheap vote. I predict in 20 years, 30 years, Māori wards will be normal. They will be universally adopted and people will wonder what the argument was all about. And just like the homosexual law reform or marriage equality, and Simon Watts scoffs, he probably voted no. Maybe that's why he's scoffing. The point is that we look back, people might look back to their grandparents' views at that time, and they might look back with disgust, or they might be ashamed at the position that their grandparents voted on at that issue, which in time you wonder what on earth the fuss was about. That is my challenge to these members today. In 20 years, 30 years' time, are you going to be proud of yourselves? Because what you are doing today is you are voting to impose a stricter criteria on things that reflect that impact on Māori and Māori only. The Minister's defence of the government's position that rural wards are different because there is a provision to go to the Local Government Commission was pitiful. Absolutely pitiful. If they wanted a level playing field, simply make Māori wards have the same provision, then you've got what you say you're after. But no. If there was a members' bill in Parliament today proposing, Mr. Speaker, that what they are putting forward for Māori wards apply to rural wards or urban wards or any other form of wards, but especially rural wards, they would vote against it because they would argue that there's a very good chance that the much higher population urban areas in those districts would not vote in the rural people's interests. And because rural people vote for them. But the same rationale that they would use to oppose this provision on rural wards, they are saying is a virtue for the sake of Māori wards. That is why I say this is racially motivated, because their principles apply when it suits them. Their principles apply when there's a chance they might be able to get 5% of the vote in order to form government. I think it's disgraceful. And I'm not surprised that there are a couple of backbenchers that are looking down, because if I was on their side, I'd be looking down too. I would be ashamed. Because this isn't anything to do with democracy. This is a political expedient opportunity to kick Māori while they're down. They finally got an opportunity, local government, to put forward the idea of Māori wards in exactly the same way that they would consider any other ward. That is all that the change did, exactly the same way. And they are changing this knowing that some communities will vote these out and deprive Māori of a voice. That some communities that have never had a Māori councillor voted for Māori wards because they knew that it would benefit and add to their decision making. 50 mayors plus have signed a letter to this government saying, do not do this. This is an overreach. They are ignoring them. Another example of this government ignoring local government, appalling minister. No one likes him because he never turns up, and when he does turn up, he lectures them just like he did then. And it's another example of this government breaking promises. They went right round the country. Oh, Simon Watts is quieting down because he knows what I'm going to say. He went round the country and promised local government that if National were elected, they would help them pay for their water. And what did they do when they got elected? They broke that promise.
That's right.
And that is why so many mayors went for them instead of water reform, because they promised them they would pay and they lied to them.
That's right.
And today they are ignoring them. Shame on this government for ignoring local communities that have made a decision for themselves and putting extra burden on people because they're Māori. It's a disgrace.
I'd say the later part was a bit irrelevant, but I think we get the message of what Kieran's trying to say.
Yeah, democracy is a very, very bad mechanism for protecting the rights of minorities. That's what it comes down to. And he's quite right. It took far longer than it should for the LGBTQ plus community to have their rights acknowledged in this country, simply because Parliament was too scared to do it on its own, to take leadership on those issues, and had to wait until there was a sea change in public opinion. He's right, there'll be a sea change in public opinion on this issue at some point in the future, but Parliament really should be taking the initiative and acting in its own right, and saying, and you know, I'd like, they can be bipartisan about developers. Why can they not be bipartisan about an issue like this that seems to be, you know, clear on the face of it?
I think part of that is because you've got two parties in government who very specifically created policies to target Māori and Māoridom. And so to get a bipartisan approach to parties that are putting their foot down and going, no, we need to wipe out any mention of Te Reo Māori. That kind of thing is really hard to get bipartisan agreement on. And I reckon good on the left for sticking to their guns on this one, that it is one of those social changes that Kieran's right about. You know, in 20, 30 years' time, it'll be normal. But until then, we still have to deal with what's in place now. And like the provision itself for the referendum that was initially put in is a really fascinating one, because it was put in the 2002 Local Government Act, and it was done by the late Rod Donald, and he did it because councils actually came to him and said, we want to have Māori seats. We want to make sure that we've got representation there for local tangata whenua. And he went, you're going to upset an awful lot of white people if you do that. So we're going to put in this provision so that you have to have a referendum around it.
And actually, under that law, could you do it in the opposite direction? Say, like, as Simeon Brown put in there about Kaikoura voting unanimously not to have it, can you have 5% of the population to force it on there? Because I do know when it comes to voting systems for STV or first past the post, when that representation review comes in, if you do get a petition, you can force a vote on the voting system, but you've got to get that timing right and the signatures. You know, and also the other one is, you know, on the other bits, I think Kieran mentioned on there, like one thing that rural wards, and the other thing is community boards. Dunedin City Council has a whole heap of area that's rural. Every single rural area has a community board to represent those people, so you don't end up having it drowned out by because they only elected councillors at large. You don't have it drowned out by people unknowing. And I do know there is a convention on councils that you typically tend to support what the community board does. You don't tend to veto the community board. I mean, that's from Councillor Brady Dyer has sat there and told me that one on Hutt City Council. You tend to, you tend to support the recommendations of what community boards do, because that's what they are. They're an advisory board to make sure that their particular community does not get disadvantaged.
Yeah, and you don't need to have a referendum to set up a community board.
No. And actually, I think, as Rex knows, he's in one of those community boards.
No, I've never been on a community board.
Not on a community board. You're in an area that has it in the
Oh,
hut.
there's one. Yes. Yeah. We've got several. Although it's a hangover from when those areas were independent, and part of the payoff for losing their independence was that they got given a community board instead. However, yeah, for all of Brady, I'm not blaming Brady, and I'm not saying city council's any different, but for all of Brady's acquiescence to community boards, the kind of decisions that they're making are frankly not very important.
Yeah, I think they should also have a bit more say than what they do. And maybe we need to actually take a look at Auckland Council to see what community boards are, because their community boards actually do a lot of good for the community, and they actually are very good advisory boards, whereas I do believe the hut ones are just rubber stampers.
Yeah, they look at small donations or not grants for things, local things, that kind of stuff. If there's development going on of the civic centre in their area, they'll have some input on the design. There's nothing earth-shattering comes before community boards at all.
Yeah. Let's go to Cameron Luxton from the ACT Party to see what he's got to say.
Mr. Speaker, ACT campaigned against Labor's Māori wards regime, and voters put us in government with the expectation that we'll keep our promises. With the restoration of local referendums enshrined in our coalition agreement, we are keeping that promise. The aforementioned group of activist mayors that are going against what the community want because they were afraid of the community which they represent having a say in case they go against what they want. They are on a highway to nothing. ACT says that all New Zealanders are alike in dignity, and this should be reflected in our institutions. With Māori wards legislation set to pass first reading, we're celebrating a step towards a democracy that recognises our common humanity and does not treat you differently based on who your ancestors were. This bill gives effect to the coalition government's commitment to restore the right to a local referendum on the establishment or ongoing use of Māori wards. The fact is that Māori have been doing a fantastic job at local government level being elected. 13.5% of local government representatives are Māori. This is very close to the share of Māori in the general population, but it goes further. This government, for many years, has been passing treaty settlement bills, and this has been creating post-settlement entities which have got entrenched rights to be consulted within local government. Mr. Speaker, the change which the government is bringing will bring strength of a democratic, with the strength, of a democratic election behind it, sees Kiwis as individuals. In a democracy, we never say that the will of the people, as we heard tonight from the Green member in question time, we never say that the will of the people is an insurmountable obstacle to democracy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
That was very quick and brief. I was not expecting it to be that quick.
It's very American.
I'm lost for words. There's just so much wrong in everything he said. Did he go to school? Oh, geez. I mean, even if the outcome is what they want, there is not ever going to be a situation where somebody has more than somebody else based on their race. They're going to have a Maori ward in which they get one vote instead of a vote in another ward or or at large. I don't know whether I don't think he's actually being disingenuous. I think he is that stupid. That's my impression.
I think he should stick to building houses instead of trying to build speeches and local democracy models. I mean, his number of 13.6% of local councillors are now Māori. It's like, how do you think they got there? How much? There was something like 40 new councils that put in place Māori wards after this change of law under Labour. That brought on a ton more Māori representation to those local councils, and he's sitting there cheering, going, "Look how represented they are," because of that law change that you now want to revoke. Like, it just. It's
prior to
deliberately set up to roll things back.
As an example, prior to 2019, there were more Johns that were councillors in New Zealand than there were females.
Yeah.
As an example, and we could probably sit there and say there are more Johns on councils than there are Hones.
Yeah. Oh. I just got news in that former Waipa District Councillor and mayoral candidate James Parlane has died in a 2-vehicle car crash on State Highway 3 last week.
Oh.
Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry to bring everybody down.
Notifications that come through.
Yeah.
Yeah. Definitely going to be on there. Now we get to the fun part of the show. This is where we get submissions on there, and thank goodness we're holding our own show based on the same thing. To put your submissions in on Māori wards. Now, actually, there is something I definitely want. We don't need to get to Te Anau Tuiona's bill yet. Something that is not being debated about in this legislation is the fact that they are making adjustments to the voting periods and nominations period. Under current law, the election day for local bodies 2025 is Saturday the 11th of October. And there are set dates in there. Nominations day under current law would be August the 15th, that nominations have to be in. They are looking at changing the law that would make that to be August the 1st. And then also for when voting papers get sent out, at the moment under current law, it is Saturday the 19th is when voting papers start being sent out. But New Zealand Post says they would not be able to deliver that target in a 21-day turnaround time for local bodies. So they are shifting it that the voting papers will be sent out on Monday the 8th or Tuesday the 9th of September. Now, here's something useful to sit there and know. 2022, we did our shows on, I think it was either a 6 or 7 week turnaround time from shows there. And at that point, we're only ever doing single shows. I think we've worked out in a draft schedule, we're looking at a 7-week turnaround period, and that would give us 35 1-hour community board shows and 126 2-hour shows based on 2 2-hour shows during weekdays and 4 2-hour shows on the weekend. That is a draft schedule that is not definitely set in stone. But with the extension of an extra 2 weeks, It's in the Ballot could sit there and deliver 10 more 1-hour community board shows and 36 2-hour mayoral, councillor or regional councillor shows. So on that part, for instance, the Ballot, us as an organisation, that will be brilliant because that could bring in more candidates for scrutiny. So, as I'd call it, they have a good piece in the bill filled with a lot of garbage.
Yeah. I mean, that change has to reflect the fact that snail mail doesn't work the way it used to. Like, it's nowhere near as regular as it was. Deliveries are nowhere near as regular as they were when that bill was first set up. We communicate in different ways now. So that is not a bad thing to have in there, but it's going to be one of those things where it's the baby thrown out with the bathwater. You know, it needs to be a separate piece of legislation by itself just to correct the changing world that we live in.
Yeah, and Celia Way-Brown actually pointed that in the House. So, yes, if you want to get your submissions on that bill, we will put the link in Block Paul's face back off again. And you've got until Wednesday night to put the bill in. It's in the Ballot. We'll be putting in a submission, and we're putting it as it's in the Ballot, not as as an individual submission, because as a organisation, we get if you're an organisation or a group, you get 10 minutes at Select Committee, not 5. So we'd get more time, and we can sit down there and stir the pot a little, considering both Ginny Anderson and Tamitha Paul did not appear on It's in the Ballot in 2023, and they sit on the Justice Select Committee.
I love the fact, though, that this Select Committee has at least 2 members of it who understand full well how much local body voters hate being told to make a decision that they thought was settled. You've got Jamie Arbuckle, you've got Tamitha Paul. They both understand the risks of taking something back to a local body authority governance voting base and say, wow, we know that you thought things were settled, but choose again.
Yeah. Anything you want to say there, Rex?
No, I think that's a very good point, actually. I hadn't considered that, but you're right. I think that's going to annoy a great number of people. And as going back to what Kieran said, I mean, that this whole thing seems to be motivated by playing to what is a very small base, really, of perhaps New Zealand First voters. I guess this is the favour National are prepared to do to keep their coalition partners in the headlines and hopefully in the minds of voters. But I do wonder what damage it's going to do to National's chances.
Considering they stood a Māori electorates in the last general election for the first time since 2005.
Yeah, I don't think they'll be welcome back anytime soon after this.
And actually, they had one brilliant candidate, Hinarera Tihau. I think that's how you say her name. I would say brilliant national candidate. I think you're standing for the wrong party, but she is one who I would, where I would like to sit there and actually see in Parliament. Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Now, here's the...
I was going to say, unfortunately, I need to duck off because I have a meeting in about 4 minutes. But before I go, I've got two things for you. One, feel free to join me on my YouTube channel tonight with Sam, who is joining us for a special looking at the budget. Just do a search for Paul, the other one. It's super easy to find. It's a fantastic conversation. We cut out most of what Sam said, so it times it really well. And if people want to make a submission on that particular bill around Māori wards, they can have a look at my Facebook page and my Instagram page. I've actually got my submission on there with some points in there for people if they want to make their own. But I also recommend people have a read of He Piki Tūranga, He Piki Kotuku, which was the report on the future of local government that was done last year. There's a whole bunch of really interesting stuff in there about how Māori wards help us meet the bare minimum requirements under Te Tiriti o Waitangi's partnership agreement. So fantastic read for people to have a look at for those ones. Until later, thank you very much for having me, Sam. I'm sorry I couldn't be here for longer.
Thank you, Paul, for jumping into it and help make more of a constructive debate.
That's what I'm here for. Happy to help. I will catch you guys later.
See you later. Okay, so the other bill that is coming on the paths there is the Restoring Citizenships Removed by Western Samoa Act 1982, which was a piece of legislation that tried to circumvent a particular was it a High Court or a Supreme Court ruling at the time? Because I think you might more remember about that.
Put me on the spot there. I think it was the appeal court, but I no doubt some legal beagle, Graham Edgler or someone will jump on later and prove me wrong.
Yeah, but it's effectively reversing that particular act, which basically meant anyone who was of Samoan citizenship basically did not have rights to New Zealand citizenship, which was the case beforehand. So that bill, that submissions closed this Friday after Budget Day, and the Contracts Insurance Bill, which closes next Monday, which is basically about putting insurance policies into plain language.
Well, yeah, broadly. I think the Western Samoa citizenship bill, I would hope would be uncontroversial, although considering what I just said about democracy not doing a great job of protecting minorities, but I haven't seen the submissions, but I would hope there wouldn't be a single submission against that. It seems to be fairly uncontroversial in restoring the status quo, if you like.
It also was voted for in favour by both ACT and New Zealand First.
Oh, well, they're in favour. Goodness me.
It was a bit of a shock that both of them were in there, and National was the only one that opposed it.
Really? Oh.
Yeah.
Dear me.
No, it was a shock. It was a shock members bill that actually passed on that particular members day.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I remember it going through there. Yeah. Well, thank you for joining us, Rex, and for Paul and Gabrielle earlier for being on the show. Is this worthy of Hut Radio?
Yes, I'm sure that we can arrange to podcast these things. The contributions of the members speaking, I think, is particularly valuable. Remind people what was said when some of these bits of legislation were introduced. So yes, let's talk about that.
Yeah, no, it's great pleasure having you back on this time, first time on the Order Paper, but back on the It's in the Ballot airwaves again. I feel like I'm currently wearing two hats because we've got a special local bodies coming up and seem to be sitting down there and doing it. I can say 3 people since we started our show at 12:07, have actually confirmed their participations for it. It's in the ballot for the Tauranga City Council special local body elections, which are happening next month. And I think they are now seeing the automated posting going out of all the things in there, which we're actually due to have one to go out or would have just gone out at 2:00. And just for those who want a reminder, we have our budget special this Thursday, where Nicola Willis will deliver her first budget to the nation, and we will be there watching with it, and we'll see how many Chubba Chup lollipops I'll get in a tax cut. As apparently she's promised it's going to be a bit more than what was expected, so we might see if it's 4 instead of 3. Yeah.
Indeed. It'll be an interesting time. I'm sorry I can't be there, but I'll be busy reporting on it. So it is going to be an interesting day.
You go to the lockup?
I do. I occasionally flex the reporting muscle still. So I will be reporting for some overseas newspapers on the New Zealand budget because they kind of forget that we exist, and when they do get a reminder, then they've got nobody to cover it. So they say, "Well, you can do it." So that's where I'll be earning my crust.
Tell us the whole budget experience of what's going on in the lockup. I'm like, I'd love to actually find that out because it's something that I've personally never experienced before because I don't quite have the same journalistic clout that you do. But yeah, it could be quite an interesting thing to find out.
Yeah, lockups are a strange beast. I mean, the trouble is now, it used to be a great privilege to go into the lockup because, and you had your phones taken off you, as you still do, and so forth. But if you'd managed to smuggle a device in there, you could probably have got very, very rich because there were major announcements being made and you were privy to them 2 or 3 hours before they emerged from the Treasurer's lips. Nowadays, so much is announced in advance or leaked, as with the first home owners grant ending, that it's a bit of a damp squib, really, and I don't know whether lockups are really worth attending, but it's the only way you get enough lead time to actually write about what's happening. So unfortunately, let's just hope the catering's up to standard to make it worthwhile.
Well, fingers crossed. Okay, well, we'll see everyone at 1:30 p.m. this Thursday and back here at midday next Monday for our King's Birthday special. Thanks for watching and see you next time.
Paper, your express ticket to the New Zealand House of Representatives. Every episode, we unravel the complex world of legislation, debate, and democracy. From bills to select committees, we've got it all covered. From our team of political commentators who will dissect and explain what's happened so you can remain up to date on what's happened in the Aotearoa New Zealand Parliament. To support our channel, you can become a Patreon member at patreon.com/itsintheballot. The Order Paper podcast is brought to you by It's in the Ballot Productions, live at 12 p.m. New Zealand.